You've probably heard about debt as a bad thing, but the truth is that not all debt is bad. In fact, when used correctly, debt can actually help you grow in ways that literally wouldn't be possible otherwise. In this video, I want to briefly explain the difference between good debt and bad debt, how leveraging works, and why having a clear plan matters before taking on any kind of loan. So first off, what is debt? At its core, it's just borrowed money. You make an agreement with someone, they loan you some of their money, and you give it back later, usually with a bit extra so it's worth their time. That's all debt is. Not automatically harmful, not automatically helpful. What really matters is why you're borrowing it and what you're going to do with it. In fact, even large successful companies regularly use debt as a tool to expand, increasing their financial flexibility and taking advantage of opportunities they couldn't afford on cash alone. So the idea that debt is always bad just isn't true. This brings us to the concept of leveraging debt. That might sound like some business jargon, but it's actually pretty simple. All it means is that you use the borrowed money to create more value than you could on your own. Here's a simplified scenario. Look at this guy. He just started up a small business where he makes custom shirts. So he wants to produce more shirts, but he can't actually afford the equipment to make it happen. But if he could, it'd let him speed up his production, if only he could afford the equipment. This is where debt comes in. He borrows some money, which is debt. But remember, debt is a tool. So he uses the borrowed money to buy the equipment that he couldn't afford last time. And now the equipment lets him produce way more than before. Suddenly, his income goes up. Not because he magically got better at his job, but because the borrowed money allowed him to do something that he couldn't do before. And that increase in income, that's what helps him pay off the loan. And ideally, once the loan is paid, he's still earning more than he used to. That's what leveraging debt is all about, using someone else's money to create value that outlives the debt itself. Of course, this is a perfect scenario. Real life is much more complicated, and sometimes you just can't guarantee that you'll return a good profit. This is why many companies opt to use debt in moderation. While debt can often boost growth, when people or companies take on way too much of it, that's when things get risky. The more you borrow, the harder it can be to make that much money to pay it back. So while leveraging can be powerful, the effectiveness of it depends not just on doing it, but on doing it wisely. So obviously, debt can become a problem, especially when it isn't used to create value. This is what we typically think of as bad debt, borrowing money for things that don't generate any return, like vacations, unnecessary purchases, or even just covering expenses. When the debt doesn't produce more income or value, it's your future earnings that have to pay it back, and that's when it becomes stressful. I've seen this myself. I know someone who owns a small business, and at one point she took out a sizable $40,000 loan to help cover her expenses. The money definitely helped out in the short term, but it wasn't used in a way that generated extra income. There was no investment that would grow and pay off the debt. And because the borrowed money wasn't creating any new income, it eventually ran dry. But while the money's gone, the debt still remains. And that's when debt becomes a burden, creating a constant, ongoing pressure that eats away at your savings. Ultimately, I think it's important to recognize that how debt affects you depends pretty heavily on your planning. Studies on household debt show that people in different income levels tend to use debt very differently. Wealthier households often use debt strategically, while lower income households are more likely to carry high interest debt like credit cards, which don't usually build long-term value and can become difficult to pay off. These patterns reveal that borrowing isn't the problem by itself, it's a lack of planning. Again, debt isn't automatically good or bad, it depends entirely on how it's used. When debt has a purpose, creates value, and is backed by a clear plan, it can be a pretty powerful tool for building wealth. But without a plan, debt can easily become a dramatically long-term burden. So the key idea to remember is this: good debt works for you, bad debt makes you work for it.